All right. Well, welcome everybody to the CERF working session. I think this is our fourth and final one before the application deadline on the 25th. I want to thank each of you for taking the time out of your day to join us, and for many of you for participating in each of the CERF working sessions up to this point, and for your ideas and feedback all throughout the process. We have been learning a lot and iterating, and we're excited to share where we are today and get a last round of feedback to further refine kind of the structure of our application. So before we jump into it, just a couple of quick kind of housekeeping items. Many of you kind of know the drill here. We would love to ask each of you to just take a minute to update your nameplate with your name and the organization in which you are representing. You can do that by clicking the three dots at the top right-hand corner of your video and then clicking on rename. That way folks can kind of get a sense of who's here and where you're representing. The other option that we'd like to note is that we do have the chat open. We would love to ask you to be putting your ideas in the chat, but also just to introduce yourself in the chat and note that you're here, where you're working from, what county you represent. We do keep all of the chat documented, so any ideas throughout the entire webinar, feel free to utilize that. So before we jump into it, I want to turn to my Uplift colleagues, Bruce and Tara, for some welcoming comments. I know we have been really enjoying the process working with you all up to this point. So I'll turn it over to start with Bruce.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Melissa. Great to see everyone here. And yes, Tom Petty, very cool. Hi, Bruce Tensley, Economic Development Collaborative. We're, of course, here in Ventura, Santa Barbara, and the environs around. This is exciting. We are getting near the point of one of our major milestones to get this application in. But let's take a moment to kind of reflect how we got here. We all know that it's a little bit about COVID-19. It's still hanging around with us, unfortunately. And we know that we had a wildly disproportionate impact from COVID on low-income workers, on minority workers, on women, on workers in industries paying less than living wage in many cases. And so we've got an opportunity here, not only to address that, but to make right on a lot of economic development investments for the region, doing this in a much more deliberate, more thoughtful, more disruptive way. All of that is by way of saying we're thrilled to have you here, have your inputs. This is toward getting our application shaped to make sure we get in and get the planning money, and then have everyone's involvement to really shape that up going forward. Looking forward to doing that, and looking forward to working on some breakout groups today. And I'm kicking it, I believe, to Tara. Are you there, Tara?
I am. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Tara Garaya, President, CEO of Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, and we're in the northern part of the 6-county CERF region. Apologies for the little bit of an echo to do some reshuffling. But very happy to be here. I can't believe we're already here in the home stretch. We've got a couple more days left to go. It wasn't too long ago that we were just sort of ideating what that could be and what could be the art of the possible. How do we engage our stakeholders to what a possible governance structure should look like, could look like. We don't have all of the answers, and post-award, fingers crossed, we can meaningfully and intentionally work together for more inclusive sort of planning and development for our region, and really make sure that our communities who are truly disinvested and need to recover out of this pandemic, that we can all do our part in helping uplift our entire coast and our entire community. So it's really lovely to see you all. It's always nice to see everybody, but the fact that we've stuck through this and now we're at the end stage, it's like the sprint line, you can see the end, and then after that our work really begins, especially for post-award. So thank you for making the time, thank you for being here, and I'm just really excited. And kick it back to Melissa.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's more like the sprint to get to the marathon, because the next chapter is going to be some deep, long range work as a community. So we'll just jump in to our agenda for the day. I think on the next slide, just so that you know what to anticipate. Brief welcome. We're going to go over some of the application components. I think many of you may have seen the slide deck just a couple of hours ago. Hopefully got a quick chance to glance over it. If not, we're going to review it in some detail. And then we're going to split into some breakout sessions to get your feedback, your ideas, any red flags or refinements that we might want to consider as we finalize the application. And then we'll come back as a group together and make sure that we hear what the top line issues were in each of the smaller breakout sessions before we wrap up with next steps. So you all have seen this slide before, kind of our sprint timeline. Here we are in our final working session as we approach application deadline next Monday. And the overview of the key application components. So we have spent some time as a group in June on the first 4 building blocks of governance, data and research, stakeholder engagement, and capacity building. There's been quite a bit of iteration and refinement based on your ideas and feedback that we're going to kind of brief out and see if we've met the mark. And then we're also going to dig a little deeper into the budget and the HRTC partnerships as the 6 major building blocks that are rounding out the application. So we will start with governance, which is a big topic. We had a lot of really good engagement in our working sessions on governance and really tried to incorporate a lot of the ideas. This is a heavy slide in terms of content. We wanted it to be something that people could understand if they weren't getting the briefing here today. But generally speaking, what you see here is what we're calling our CERF planning North Stars, or our guiding principles. But really the heart of this phase 1 planning process is to strike a balance between economic opportunity in terms of economic competitiveness and job quality and access, along with equity and sustainability. And these 3 guiding principles are really the overarching goals of the entire CERF process. At one point in our governance structure conversation, we talked about having roundtables based on these different key issue areas. And what really got elevated for us based on the group feedback was that these needed to permeate much more than just one roundtable discussion. They needed to be the principles in which are driving the entire planning process. So as you hear us walk through governance and stakeholder engagement and data and all the components, these themes are going to be thread throughout. So just keep in mind that this is our planning North Stars, and they will saturate in everything that we're doing. So I think you can see in the next slide, we talked quite a bit in the past about our large geography and our 6-county region, and all of us, working in the communities really have felt that there's a natural kind of sub-regional break in our 6 counties to the north and to the south, with the north being Santa Cruz, San Benito, and Monterey, and the south being San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura. There are planning efforts that acknowledge and work within those kind of tri-county areas. And we wanted to build upon that while also creating the infrastructure to come together as a 6-county region. So it's a little bit of a hybrid model. On this next slide, you can kind of see what this is going to look like. So on the very far left of this slide are the 12 constituency groups that have been outlined in the CERF process to be a part of the decision making, with each one of these groups having equal voice and participation into governance. And just to note that governance is really the decision making of the overall planning process, but there is a wide breadth of input engagement from the stakeholder community, which we'll brief out in our kind of stakeholder engagement component. So as you think about governance and decision making and what that looks like, see the 12 groups that are outlined on the left. We're proposing to have 2 sub-regional steering committees with 12 people in each steering committee, with 1 representative from each of those 12 groups. Those sub-regional steering committees would meet monthly in their kind of tri-county regions. We would then kind of map those all up into an integrated 6-county regional joint steering committee, which would include all 24 of the steering committee members. Our goal would be to have a chair for each, the North and the South, and those 2 leaders would come together and co-chair the regional steering committee. You can see, and I'll brief out in a little more detail, you see these kind of issue bubbles on the right. We're calling those our issue roundtables, but this is really the flexible framework in which we're going to be creating issue-based kind of planning tables. We started out by trying to define those in our governance structure, and then we really, based on feedback, took a step back and really wanted the steering committee to be able to prioritize and set up the appropriate issue-based roundtables throughout the process. So we anticipate having several guided by the steering committee and other means of stakeholder input and engagement, but that kind of just shows you how it flows in. And then I will, underneath, you can kind of see project administration, and I will share a little bit in more detail of what some of those kind of key administrative functions are. So I'll go through these a little bit in a little bit more detail. So the Joint Steering Committee, I kind of shared a little bit. That is the overarching steering committee for the 6-county region, the combined 2-county the sub-regional steering committees coming together on a monthly basis. They are ultimately the body that is approving projects and programs and guiding and shaping the development of the plan, the process, the spending, all that. This is kind of the top of the governance structure. I think on the next slide, the sub-regional steering committees, they obviously are, if you're on the sub-regional steering committee, you're also a member of the Joint Regional Steering Committee, but it allows you to go into a little bit more kind of nuanced detail in the sub-regional issues that might exist. We may have issue-based roundtables that are only in a tri-county area, or we may have issue-based roundtables that kind of permeate and go across the 6-county region. And we're going to allow the steering committee to help shape and direct what that looks like. So the advisory committee, this is something new that we have formed within the governance based on the feedback that we received in our working sessions in June. And the advisory committee, I'll take a minute to talk through this because I think it's a really important component. So the advisory committee, we're saying 6 to 12 underrepresented community leaders with a minimum of 6, 1 per county. We wanted to create a little flexibility to expand that if necessary, but this is going to be almost like an executive committee. It's going to be an administrative function, and we want this group to do a couple of key things. One is to kind of protect the integrity of the planning process in terms of how true are we staying to our North Stars of economic opportunity and equity and sustainability. They will also function as a nominating committee. So the steering committee will be formed with the recommendation of the advisory committee. They will oversee a process by which people can be nominated or they can apply to serve in any one of those roles. So we will conduct a process to make sure that we are really thoughtful and equitable about the way in which leaders are selected to serve in the steering committee roles. The advisory committee will also, and you'll hear a little bit more about this in some detail, they will administer a process as well for projects and programs that might be seeking funding. So we all know that there's the CERF phase 1 planning process, and then there's the phase 2 where you can have implementation opportunities for funding, and it's required that the steering committee, the HRT steering committee, approves and supports that, and that those programs are part of this overall process. And so the advisory committee will oversee a process in which there will be a criteria set primarily by the state, but also in line with our planning process, true to those kind of 3 planning North Stars, where folks can submit ideas, programs, projects for funding. If those kind of that quality control of the advisory committee sees that they check all the appropriate boxes, they will recommend them to approval to the steering committee, who will be able to prioritize and ultimately offer support to key projects aligned with the planning process. So this is a kind of a new layer within kind of the overarching governance structure. And then project administration, this is a little more straightforward. We've talked about this over the course of the last several weeks, that the Uplift Coalition is a shared kind of project management model where the three organizations of REACH, MBEP, and the EDC are a kind of a joint convening and project administrator with the Economic Development Collaborative serving as the fiscal agent, REACH serving as the regional convener, and then each of our three organizations serving as sub-regional conveners and supporting all of the stakeholder outreach and so forth. And then I think finally, the issue roundtables, and this is kind of a blend into stakeholder outreach, but this was kind of shared a little bit around there are going to be key issues that are going to need deeper discussion and a broad cross-section of different stakeholders, whether it be infrastructure or childcare or whatever the opportunities that may need to go into a little bit more detail. The steering committee will create these issue roundtables for folks, and they'll be ad hoc. Maybe they'll be meeting for a long time, maybe they'll be meeting for a short time, but ultimately it'll be designed with some flexibility for the steering committee to create the engagement issue concept to come around for the community. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh, who's going to share about our second building block within the application, data and research.
Sure. Thank you, Melissa, and great to see everyone today. Wanted to just give a quick update on kind of where our thinking is at on the data and research side, really building on some of the good working sessions we had last month. I think one thing that came out crystal clear in those sessions and that we really tried to take on board here is understanding that kind of the primary gap and challenge that we're going to face as a region is making sure that we're getting the right data and collecting it and engaging on it in the right way with our underinvested communities. And I think key feedback point that we've tried to incorporate here is really recognizing that this is a process. This isn't just about kind of finding the right data set out there or developing it. It's about working with these communities, finding trusted partners in these communities who can help advance this broader effort, working together to collect the right data on our underserved and marginalized populations, and really collaborating together to making sure that the analysis of that is aligned and that the kind of prioritization coming out of that data collection effort again, is done in a way that's in partnership with these communities. And again, this permeates far beyond, I think, the kind of data and research bucket itself. We recognize that this is part and parcel of our stakeholder outreach component, as well as the capacity building efforts that are going to be focused on supporting these underserved communities, not only to participate in the process, but to make sure that the data collection can happen and the analysis and decision-making can take place as well together. So again, I just wanted to, I think, start with that point, because again, that I think came out as probably the top area of feedback from the last working session, and wanted to recognize that we're kind of prioritizing that and putting it, I think, in the forefront as we think about the data efforts as part of the phase 1 planning process. Maybe just taking a little bit of a step back when we think about data writ large in the planning efforts, I think we wanted to recognize a few key features here. And I recognize this is a very heavy slide that's going to be difficult to read. So don't try to squint at your computer, but I just want to kind of give a quick overview. There'll obviously be key data sets coming into the analysis for the work, but I think we wanted to underscore that when we think of the CERF North Star guidelines, making sure that our decision-making, when it comes to projects and initiatives, are aligned with that, making sure that the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve are aligned with those North Star guidelines, and really making sure that our proposed metrics that we're judging ourselves by and holding ourselves accountable are also aligned, again, with those same kind of overarching themes for our effort. And part of this effort will include creating some sort of public visualization or dashboard as well, so that we're actually putting out the data so folks can see the progress that we're making as an initiative, kind of track as we go forward in terms of kind of what are the metrics that we're hitting and what we're not. Again, trying to make it a more transparent process, trying to make it a more data-driven process, and making sure all of those efforts are aligned with those key North Stars that we looked at the beginning. In terms of other data and efforts out there, I think just wanted to quickly recognize, again, a lot of good feedback collected in the earlier working sessions. We recognize there are significant, active, and really robust efforts happening across the 6-county region already. The K-16 Collaborative being one example of that. The Arts Councils, again, being another great example of already existing 6-county efforts underway, really wanting to make sure that the CERF project is fully integrated, aligned, and working in conjunction and in partnership with all of these different activities that are already happening across our region. And again, this is just a snapshot of those. We know there are probably many more, but want to make sure that's, again, kind of in the forefront as we begin the planning efforts, fingers crossed, later this fall. And finally, I think just want to recognize as well, there's a lot of good data sets being created by these initiatives already. A lot of good work underway, and wanting to, again, make sure that we're not duplicating effort, but really taking advantage of what's already out there, integrating it appropriately into these CERF efforts as well. And kind of final piece I'll just flag is, as we start this initial mapping exercise for the application, really making sure that we're integrating our data sets for these disinvested communities. We know those are the hardest ones in order to collect the right data, but there are some data sets out there to start kind of the mapping process of identifying where those communities are. And so we've been doing a little bit of that work already, and you can see a visualization of that right here. But just wanted to flag that will continue to be a real focus, again, as we advance towards the phase 1 planning efforts. And with that, I think we'll pass it off to Tara for the stakeholder engagement.
Yes, thank you, Josh. Let's see if I'm able to sort of look and read at my slide. We have a lot that we've presented, and I just really want to say thank you to everybody, because these working sessions have been instrumental in getting feedback, getting input from all the communities across our 6 counties. And I strongly feel the bedrock of what we're trying to accomplish is really a stakeholder engagement, and making sure our communities are in fact represented, and making sure that we take different tactics and approaches to engage community where they're at. And that was one of the biggest things that we heard. There are unprecedented levels of engagement and investments happening in our region, in our state. I think what's really exciting for me is the level of accountability, as well as the level of engagement that this particular application is requiring of all of us, and how thoughtful it's asking us, not just within the actual current application process, but post-award, how do we come together to make sure? So there are a couple of ways that we intend to initially propose stakeholder outreach and engagement. It'll take place across multiple channels. And again, the goals are ensuring transparent planning process and capturing the critical participation and input from key constituents. One of which is publicly available website, making sure that folks have the ability to be asynchronously engaged, whether that's by recording, having input through a website, or having access to data and dashboard and other materials. The other is virtual and hybrid meetings. I mean, a lot of the application is asking us to address what's happened and what manifested and brought to light during the pandemic. How do we make sure that as we still continue to live through the pandemic, create the opportunities for all of our communities to be engaged virtually or in the hybrid format? And issue roundtables. There are multiple issues that we deal with that live in our communities that we need to address and focus, but how do we organically allow those issues to come to the surface without being so prescriptive, and creating space for a number of issue roundtables, keeping them focused on the convening and making sure there's record of having that information shared, living on a website, at the same time allowing them to organically formulate. We will also have an inclusivity fund we're hoping to set aside, and we'll get a little bit more detail about the percentages of the budget. But this is, again, a bedrock of engaging the community for true inclusive economic development plans. And without resourcing our communities and making an inclusivity sort of fund or a way to resource, it's difficult for engagement. And we also have to recognize the efforts of resourcing individuals and organizations. Another tactic or approach is sub-regional convening. We are such a large region. I mean, when the state of California divided the state in 13 regions, I think we're probably the largest and most diverse geographically across 6 counties. So we need to be mindful of that, aware and sensitive, and how do we make sure that sub-regionally we are lifting up the needs and getting them up to the governance structure and the feedback mechanism loop to create that at the same time. Last but not least, in constant listening sessions. I think, again, these are just multiple approaches, various channels, to ensure that there is active, transparent engagement. And there may be others we need to add. And please do feel free. This is, as we break out and in a little bit, this is keep thinking about how you can provide us feedback on all that you are listening to in this current presentation, because we're eager to hear. And in the engagement, we hope that we want to be sensitive and informed and make sure that we have, for example, translation services provided in multiple languages, childcare, make sure that an equity primer is available to all of us, as well as our leaders, our communities. What are the different ways that we can lift up information as well as voices? Are there surveys? Are we doing in-person interviews, both qualitative and quantitative gathering of data? Are we trying, how, another conduit of information could be public service announcements and advertisement, a WhatsApp chat, social media, using Parent Square, possibly through school districts. In other words, how can we utilize and not reinvent some excellent communications that communities may have, but at the same time also be open to what we may need to create moving forward. So these are just some of the strategies that we are looking to engage in. Next. Oh, there we go. Then next is this, sorry, I have two overlapping screens going on. And at the end of the day, reason for this stakeholder engagement, why it's critical through these multiple channels, is it's through those multiple channels we're able to prioritize projects and what should be funded, what should be lifted, especially around phase 2 of CERF. And one is actually resourcing and making sure those ideas come to the surface. And the other is making sure the process is equitable as we advance project ideas. So keeping that also very grounded in all that we do moving in the short term and in the long-term regional plan. And last but not least, this is simply a process of how projects can simply be prioritized from start to finish. How do ideas potentially bubble up and make sure that there is a vetting process of projects? How do they get to the steering committees, the governance structure? What is a loop back mechanism to inform those who have presented project ideas? And it's going to be live and ongoing, because the CERF phase 2 may open up sooner, open up a little bit later, but how can we as 6 counties be ready when that drops? And hence why the governance structure for multiple regions and inputs is critical as we prioritize projects and as we prioritize how we write our regional plans and leverage the CERF funding in the entire cycle. So this is how we're sort of formulating the process at this point. And thank you for your input, because it was through these various sort of working sessions that we were able to come up with this process of project prioritization. And I will kick it off to, I believe, Bruce, who will talk about capacity building.
Great, Tara, Melissa, thanks so much, and Josh. So yes, here we are, capacity building / inclusivity fund. Great to see everyone who joined us last time and see a bunch of new faces as well. So the capacity building, as you can imagine, and having just heard Tara, is really an extension, is sort of an expression and an investment in the stakeholder engagement. So you're looking at a slide here that you mostly have seen before. There have been a few pieces to this. What we're looking to do here, of course, is set us up for success going forward into the planning process. So let's kind of read the slide from left to right as you're looking at it. By creating an inclusivity fund through the CERF planning dollars, you see that on the top left, we want to make sure that we're allocating a fixed number of dollars. It's actually 25% of what we hope is a full $5 million planning allocation of 1.25 million, to make sure that we're investing in the opportunities for and the capacity building of partners. We'll come back to that a little bit. We're also thinking of this as not just a standalone one-time process, as we're also thinking of the entire CERF investment in our regional organizing and governance building, is that we don't want this just to be about the 600 million, as large as that is, CERF fund, including the money for implementation projects, but we want to create priorities, identify priorities, and influence the investment of other dollars. So as we're working with community foundations, other philanthropies, with existing state and federal dollars, that we've got sort of a framework here that we are investing in our local communities to have the capacity to engage and to be part of an economic opportunity for growing and broadly shared opportunity. So philanthropic funding, other funding. If you look at the middle of this, under the circle, in the circle, we're looking at sort of two categories of distributing funds in the Inclusivity Fund. One is so-called participant reimbursement. That could be anything from childcare expenses, stipends for participating, travel costs, offsetting the costs of childcare, any of the expenses, actual expenses incurred by individuals representing groups who are the key stakeholders in the identified stakeholders within CERF. So we want to make sure that we're making a direct investment. We're referring to the other one as sort of service contracts or service agreements and contracts. And those are the kinds of activities that we might be using to do any number of things to assure that organizations have the capacity to continuously engage. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the next slide. Not quite there, looking at, whoops, go back. The rest of this slide, there we go, is we want to prioritize this for eligibility to the truly disinvested communities, stakeholder groups that really need the advantage, the opportunity. It's going to be a little challenging to figure out how exactly we do the priorities and the criteria. To be very clear, we're not defining that a priori, we're not defining it now. That will be part of the advisory committee process, the governance process that Melissa talked about earlier. We're not making decisions now about who and how people exactly are eligible in which groups, but we need all of your input to help shape that once we get funded. That said, we're parking $1.25 million, and we've got two different kind of strategies. And what you're seeing here on the right-hand side of that slide are the defined communities of disinvested communities according to CERF. Not necessarily exclusive, but those would be the priorities. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So as mentioned, there's the participant reimbursement and the service agreements and contracts. The participant reimbursement's not all that complicated. We're looking at per diems, we're looking at transportation, and again, we'll establish those criteria and levels of funds. The service agreements and contracts have a little bit more nuance. That can be a variety of issues, filling gaps in regional stakeholder engagement. So we got 6 counties, we've got identified priority areas, but we know there are a lot of subgroups that may not yet have been identified or have been yet participating in this process. This is really about establishing the capacity for an ongoing communication structure within the region, within the target community. We want to make sure that we're broadening, as it says, deepening. The third bullet there, we're looking to secure stakeholder engagement in a manner that contributes expertise to what we're doing, because we know that while we are the conveners in a variety of ways, that's convening, that's not deciding. We need to make sure that we're bringing a complete, robust table of inputs. It may be in the next bullet, delivering training. There was a lot of discussion. We'll have a breakout session in a moment, but last month in the breakout session, there was a lot of discussion about train the trainer capacity. So while we have a constituent group, maybe it's in the environment, maybe it's in Native America, it's in any one of these groups, but make sure we're working with you to reach the rest of your stakeholder partners as well. And finally, it could be as broad as tracking engagement. We want to make sure that we've got everybody engaged, so we're developing a meaningful plan, and it's got continuous feedback and continuous investment. If you're interested in more in this, of course, there's a breakout session, or give us any kind of communication. I think that's it on this, and I think I'm passing it off to myself. So I'm going to turn around real fast, spin, and look forward. Here we are. Budget, this will be fairly brief. So we're looking at the possibility of a $5 million allocation for approximately a 2-year period in planning. And while this is not the line item budget, this is, which we're still working on, this is the sort of roll-up set of categories. We've divided into 4 kind of core categories around what are defined by CERF, the functions of convening and administration. The second one about data and research, a category that we've just sort of broken out that is very broad, and I'll come back to in a moment, consulting expertise. And then finally, what's just mentioned, the Inclusivity Fund. What we really want to make sure that we're doing here is that we're allocating as much money as absolutely possible to community groups within the region. So in every one of these categories, that may involve other community groups besides ourselves. So for convening and facilitation, each of us in the 6-county region may be reaching out for others to participate in that process. When we're looking at data and research, we may be looking at universities and that kind of capacity that are locally based to give us information. But we also anticipate that we're looking at stakeholder groups have particular expertise about the data for their domains. So we may be investing in contracts that way as well. So we're making sure that we are bringing folks into this group. Consulting expertise, looking at that, could be all those different categories identified there. I just saw it, might pause there for a moment. 40% on administration, no, that could be including convening, facilitation, all of the process of making sure that we're engaging. As you may be aware, there is a 10% limit admin funds within the grant application. So that's a $500,000 limit for administration. But the ongoing capacity, which could be shared throughout the region to make sure that we're engaging folks. This is not our final budget, but we are making sure that we are investing as much as we can on the sustainable contributions of partners. There will be more discussion on that later in the process or in each of the individual sessions, governance, I would imagine in particular, and stakeholder engagement. I'll stop there, and I believe I am kicking it back on HRTC Partnerships to Tara.
Thanks, Bruce. So as we get closer to the finish line on this proposal, in order to be truly competitive, we need to make sure we build robust partnerships, and this is where you come in. You've been very instrumental in helping provide feedback and input throughout this process, and it's been very iterative, and for that, again, thank you for that, from one-on-one conversations to emails and through these breakout sessions. Now, we really need action from you. So many of you on this list have already submitted your letters of support and partnership agreement. There's still time. Ideally, we'd like it back by tomorrow or as soon as possible, maybe by Thursday. But we really need to tie this up and turn it in by the end of the week, if not first thing Monday. So there's a template in the chat that will be shared by our friends and partners and colleagues. Please do, if you haven't done so already, adapt it to your organization, customize it, and turn it in as soon as possible. What's critical about these HRTC partnerships is in order to leverage phase 2 funding for a project, a shovel-ready project on your own or in partnership with others throughout the county, you have to be able to demonstrate that you were in fact part of the planning process or part of these conversations, of which why we're keeping record of. And having an HRTC partnership, which is essentially Uplift, they're synonymous with, and we've just decided to call ourselves Uplift. The application says HRTC for formality purposes. So we're encouraging everybody from nonprofit to municipalities and everybody. There is room for all and for all of our stakeholders to be true partners. And I encourage you all strongly to turn in a letter of support or partnership as soon as possible. And I believe I kick it back.
Yes, I think we're at the time now where we are excited to get some feedback from each of you. So in just a moment, we're going to be moving into our breakout sessions to answer questions and to collect ideas. And then we'll be coming back as a group around 3:10. So we'll have about 30 minutes in our working sessions. On the next slide, I'll just do a quick overview of kind of what to expect, what we want you to be thinking about. And these will be, organic discussions, but what is on target? What is missing? What can we refine as you think about these 6 building blocks? Any specific questions you have that we can provide answers to, or any other considerations that need to be taken in to shape ultimately the application. So that's what we're going to be looking to each of you for. I think in just the next moment, you're going to get that prompt to join a breakout group. And when you see that, just click on that and you will be whisked away for the next 30 minutes or so.